What's up, everybody? Welcome to ParaTruth Reborn. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
Bear with us as we are learning some new stuff in technology
Yeah.
land. So we're going to do our best here. But first and foremost, welcome to some videos for those of you who are tuning in on YouTube. We're excited to actually be doing this. It's something we've talked about for quite a long time. So we figured we'd give it a shot here.
Yeah, we've kind of done it in the past, but
Mhm.
this is a whole new ball game for recording them, so I'm super stoked about it.
Right, 100%. So today we figured we'd kind of stick with the theme of creepy things throughout all of October. We had some other stuff lined up, but we changed our mind. So today we're going to be doing something which is we've not talked about this very much in a while. And it's something that I think both excites Justin and I, especially with a lot of the info that we found, modern info.
And it ties to our New Orleans trip.
It
We're just
really
going with the
does.
theme.
It really does. And so today we are going to be, if you can't tell by our title, by the way, we're talking about vampires. Uh, this is like something that was really interesting. Something came up to us it was TikTok, right? Something that you sent. And
Mhm.
it made us start thinking about the legends and the lore behind the vampires. So we both decided to start doing a lot of digging, and the things we uncovered about vampire lore is just really intriguing, and at least for us, relatively new. And we've looked around online, and unfortunately, a lot of the things that we're finding are still kind of outdated, you know? Um, but with that said, I think we'll just go ahead and jump right into this. I want to begin with talking about uh, the European history, and then the American history of the vampire lore. So, to begin with the original lore of the vampire within Europe, believe it or not, despite much belief, the idea of the vampire didn't actually exist during the Dark Ages, which is news because a lot of us thought that
Yep.
vampires existed then.
I just
Um,
mentioned that to you today.
Yeah. But in actuality, the vampire lore post dates werewolf trials, witch hunts, and the demon haunted Puritans. So think about that. It's kind of incredible to think of how young the vampire lore is compared to some of these other things that we've talked about over the years, all of us.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, the concept of the vampire as an undead creature actually inflicting harm originated in Bulgaria around 1,000 years ago. Now, the legend itself was isolated among the Slavic people and not well known elsewhere in the world, if known at all for that matter. Now, the word vampire roughly translates to, and this is important, ghost monster. Now, this is important as early Slavic beliefs regarded the vampire as a non corporal or spiritual entity. And in fact, there was no lore to support the idea of a vampire turning people into other vampires, nor was there any lore regarding its thirst for blood. Big news.
Yeah.
Now, instead, it was actually believed that the vampire would wreak havoc by spreading disease among villages and was often noted as being a ghost like being that worked kind of similarly to rats. Now, for anyone listening, do you remember how the Black Plague of 1346 started? Well, so it also went wherever this vampire went. It would enter into a village, and disease would just spread and start causing all kinds of havoc and killing people left and right. Now, due to war, the vampire lore actually began to move west around 1686, which, take a moment to think about this, 1686 was 6 years prior to the infamous Salem witch trials. Now, if you've not listened to our episode on the Salem witch trials from many years ago, you should. It's one of our highest growing episodes, and we'll
Yeah.
probably have to do another one pretty soon here. Um, but considering the fact that this lore started moving west 6 years prior to the Salem witch trials, really speaks volumes as to just how young the idea of the vampire really is in America. Now, the German speaking peoples of the Holy Roman Empire gained control of Hungary and thereby took control of a Slavic population. Imperial troops learned of the vampire legend from Slavic peasants during the occupation. Soldiers carried the idea to cosmopolitan centers like Vienna and Berlin. And then from there, the vampire moved to Paris, then from Paris to London, then from London to the Americas. And the word vampire actually first appeared in English in 1732, which happens to be, Justin, pop quiz, a very famous person was born in that same year.
George Washington.
Ooh, you're so good. Um, so now traveling east to west, in this case in the Americas, the vampires started taking on new features. And these are features that are more well known today, something that's more modernized. And those features include becoming a full-bodied risen corpse. Today they're a little more lifelike. Back in the 1730s, 1800s, there were still the undead. These are still more or less ghouls who happen to drain blood. And with that said, of course, one of the new features was the fact that they needed to consume blood. So many, many years, we're talking 13, well, what is this? Oh, we're talking about 800 years or so. 600 to 800 years from when it was first known not to drink blood to when it did drink blood.
Yeah.
And it's interestingly enough, regarding the whole consumption of blood, the fact that it even drank blood lent a scientific element to the lore. Now, we all know we love science here in the paranormal world. It's important. It helps us debunk a lot of things, especially on our ghost hunts or cryptids and etc. But the idea of which regarding the blood led to the belief of the creature being more likely to exist. It became more believable. And with that said, even after Westerners had begun moving past superstitious beliefs, science still sought an explanation for the vampire's existence. Now, in the 1700s, human blood was believed to possess medicinal qualities, and it was widely consumed as a medicine throughout Europe and the Americas by people of all levels of society. Now, today, historians actually call this medicinal cannibalism, but blood was cheap in cost due to the common use of bloodletting as a physician's tool, and blood was believed to be the vessel of the human soul, which actually stems back to biblical times. Now, by imbibing blood, one imbibed life. So what better medicine than a liquid with a residue of a human soul inside for vampires to drink from? And hence, since that time, vampires have become more or less what we know of them today. These full-bodied, more or less lifeless creatures who drink blood in order to survive.
Now, here's a pop quiz for you.
Oh,
Do you know
gosh.
the disease that is kind of linked to vampiric type?
You know what? I did read this somewhere, and offhand, I do not know it. I don't
It's
have the answer.
porphyria.
Mm.
And porphyria is a disease that will kind of give the traditional traits of what we think of for vampiric lore today. Sensitivity to light, skin blisters if you're touched by sunlight, stained teeth, and there's a couple of other symptoms, but there can be acute or chronic, and it kind of has to do with ingesting heme in order to keep your iron and your protein levels up. And so that can be a huge part of it as well, because porphyria is not something new.
Mm-hmm.
People could have been realizing, oh, if I take in blood, I'll feel better. Not to mention we have blood transfusions in surgery today too.
Right. Well, one thing that's obviously nowadays we know that for the most part, drinking blood doesn't actually have any medical benefit. And if anything, it can actually cause problems depending on the blood and whether or not there's any diseases present. But with that said, back then, the fact that the belief that blood could cure people of various ailments, mental diseases, things like that, just so it goes to show how important one's belief in something is. I mean, this was basically, without anyone knowing it, blood was basically a placebo. This was something that really wasn't having any effect, and yet people continuously believed that it was a thing. Um, I don't know. I find it interesting because nowadays here in the Americas, and this is something we learned in, uh, I guess I should say we were updated on when we were in New Orleans, but it's something I learned probably around 10 years ago on Fox News. The Fox News um, did a casting for some vampire bars, some underground vampire bars in Cleveland, Ohio. Think they named three of them offhand.
Mm.
And these are places where people can go, they can potentially meet people, and if they so desire, uh, can actually drink each other's blood. Not necessarily on site, but some were saying that people would go, they would meet someone, they would get tested for any sort of diseases within the blood, and if everything was kosher, they can then, sip a little bit on each other, which is a weird thing to say. Um, but so the idea of the vampire, obviously, as we know, reigns really strong today. And it's a far cry to what the vampire used to be of its origin. Um, to think that this creature began as a spiritual entity that simply created diseases and spread them like rats, to an entity that is living, breathing, undead creature that stalks around at night and sucks people dry of their blood in order to have their own life force refilled, uh, is a huge, huge gap between the two events. And it also goes to show us just how much the word, like the game telephone, actually was played over the course of its uh, travels from Europe to the Americas. Did people simply, you know, chime in and give their own ideas of what this vampire was, or did something get lost in communication and so it grew to be this bigger, more menacing entity than what it originally had begun as?
So something I just thought of this because you'd brought up that the vampire was originally a spiritual creature.
Mhm.
In the fictional book written by Van Helsing, vampire book that you gave me years ago,
Yes.
that in that book it talks about vampirism originating from a demon.
Right. Yeah. So there was, again, this goes back to some other lore, and this book, it was just for fun. It wasn't something that was necessarily
Yeah,
supposed to be,
right.
but there are,
Factual in any way.
right, factual in any way. But there is, I think, reasoning behind the belief system there. Even if it is fake in that case, I think, or I know it is still widespread that people think when they think of vampires, they think of the devil. In fact, we see it in movies all the time. When you show a cross to a vampire, it heats up and it harms them. It keeps them back. It drives them away because they're these unholy beings. And the reason I think that is, and as I said earlier, this stems back, like the idea of drinking blood stems back to biblical times, specifically about the blood being a life force. So in the Old Testament, God is um, he very strongly commands the Israelites not to drink blood, for the blood is a life force. In fact, in Leviticus 17:14, he states that life of every creature is in its blood, and that whoever consumes blood will be cut off from the community. Again, in Genesis 9:2-4, and I say again, it's actually Genesis comes before Leviticus, for those of you who don't know. God tells Noah, but you must not eat meat that still has its lifeblood in it. Likewise, King David refuses to drink water given to him by his soldiers because it would be a tantamount to blood drinking. And over and over again, we see throughout the Old Testament that God tells us and tells the Israelites not to drink blood because it is literally the life force. By every living being exists because of the blood. And if there is no blood in that being, it cannot exist. period. And so I think what is happening here, especially in media and modern culture, the reason why the crucifix works and stuff is because they resort back to some of these ideas or some of these commands in the Bible, and they think, oh, well, if somebody is disobeying God in that way and drinking something that's supposed to give life, and they're actually taking that life, well, they must be of the devil. They must be evil. They must, and therefore, if people at the time were drinking blood, one would argue, well, it is by demons that that person is drinking blood because the Holy Spirit wouldn't do it. And so that kind of like, I think, manifested and became this more modern take using the crucifix, claiming that these creatures were evil, that they were of Satan, that they were, I think one even called him Beelzebub, Dracula, a version of Dracula was known as Beelzebub, which is Satan within the Bible. So there is a lot of historical evidence to support the reasoning behind these entities having more of a evil essence, aside from the certain movies that shall not be named, and books for that matter, that are, about sparkly vampires.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I think it's all, everything is like really interesting. And if you really look at today's lore, you can easily follow it back to the past and even straight up to ancient times to see where it all kind of originated.
Well, and I think all of these links or articles that you found were fascinating. I think the even more fascinating part was the different type of vampires that you came across that kind of lead into the lore that we know today. And I mentioned this to you that a couple of these fit into pop culture.
Right.
So many of them link to Europe, but because of Europeans coming to America, they all kind of link to what we know today as well. The Strigoi from Romania, which is kind of where Dracula started-ish. And just like Dracula, shape-shifting into animal forms, wolves, bats, even mist, strong and fast. There are the Upir, who are from the Ukraine. Again, supposedly can change form, have super strength and speed. However, the difference with the Upir is that they were not blood drinkers per se, but life force.
So more like is that more like a psychic draining? Do we know?
Yeah, what we know today is a psychic vampire. Okay. But like I mentioned to you, the life force could still be blood.
Right.
But this article doesn't really specify that. The Nosferatu, which is the basis for Bram Stoker's Dracula, the legend that he was going by. Again, same thing, shape-shifting, controls animals, and this one drinks blood. And then I had never heard of this one before.
Well, actually, sorry, hold on. I want to stop you right there.
Oh, yep.
Because actually the Nosferatu, unlike many of the other vampire legends, does not shapeshift and can't control animals, but instead simply relies on
I read that wrong. I'm sorry.
Simply, instead they just rely on their stealth and their speed to hunt down prey. So these are more animalistic creatures. They're hunting by more by instinct than they are by reason.
So yes, thank you for catching that. I misread that. And then I don't even know how to pronounce this one. Vrykolakas.
Something like that.
It's from Greece, and according to legend, they are undead beings that rise from the grave at night to prey on the living. They are said to have superhuman strength and speed, which they use to overpower their victims. Like many other vampires, they have an insatiable thirst for blood. it just keeps going on and on. The Moroi,
Well,
the Dampier.
before you, yeah, there's so many, but the last one we were talking about, the one from Greece, one of the things that I think is interesting about that creature is they tend to be individuals who are not properly buried or who died under
Mhm.
unusual circumstances. Uh, for whatever reason, they would be the ones to become vampires, which often added a layer of fear and superstition around the death and burial practices in Greek culture. So you can actually learn a lot based on how the Greeks buried their dead as to what their fears or concerns were with. Um, Another unique aspect of the Reichholocaust, that's what we're going to say. If anyone knows how to pronounce that, not us.
Reichholocaust.
Yeah. The legend itself is actually connected to the lunar cycles. And according to some versions of the myth, the vampire creature can only come out during certain phases of the moon, particularly during full moons. Now, this has been like explored in various works of fiction, adding more layers to the creature and the complexity of legend. And as we know, this one in particular kind of stands out because who else do we know, or what other creature do we know that tends to uh, work or hunt per the lunar cycles, and that is none other than the werewolf. So we have a link right there, which I think is actually pretty interesting because uh, throughout um, pop culture, we often see the vampire and the werewolf kind of butting heads as two different beings that are at the top of the food chain, who kind of live under similar circumstances, one needing a heart to eat, the other needing blood, and constantly having to cross over into each other's territory. So seeing that something like this kind of relates to the werewolf is pretty intriguing to me.
Yeah, that was the one fascinating thing that I found out of all the stuff on the Reichholocaust, is the phase of the moon thing. That was kind of different. The Moroi, again, is kind of an undead spirit. Usually takes human form, but can transform into bats or wolves. Um, the Moroi are associated with blood sucking. Um, in some versions of the myth, they can also control the weather and natural elements, which is different, except for if you think of fog.
Mm,
The Dampier is an interesting one
very.
because it links. I forgot about this too. This links to pop culture, and we'll go into that in a second. Is a offspring of a vampire father and a human mother, possessing both human traits and vampiric parentage, which also links to the video that I sent you. And we'll talk about that in a little bit here too. But the Dampiers are said to possess special powers that allow them to detect and hunt vampires, creating a unique role for these half human, half vampire creatures. So they kind of could be vampire hunters in a sense.
Mhm.
And then the last one that they bring up, with which most people are kind of familiar with today, is the chupacabra. It actually spans more than just Mexico, which I didn't realize. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and parts of the Mediterranean Sea region. And it's kind of looks like a hairless dog with spikes that kills livestock. The name chupacabra roughly translates to goat sucker, and that was because livestock, it was usually caught draining goats, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, there have been cases where it's chickens and
Mhm.
cows as well.
Yeah, there have been cases where people claim it was chicken and cow, and actually cows have been pretty common over in the west side, southwest of the United States. Um, but again, like a lot of this is the only thing that we, and of course this goes back to just the lore. No one's ever actually seen the chupacabra, but there's just this belief because the fact that these creatures are, they're not being ripped to pieces. They're often found with two little holes or a few little holes, and then the blood just completely drained of it. So it's really intriguing that this creature exists around the world, especially since here in the US, it's been hotly debated as to whether the chupacabra was actually a creature that escaped from Area 51 at some point, and therefore is actually
Mm.
considered more of a extraterrestrial as opposed to like a cryptid.
Right. Was there anything else I missed
No, you did
on
really
that?
good. Good
Okay.
job.
um, but something that I had mentioned, sent to Eric, was this video on YouTube, or I'm sorry, TikTok, and he goes into saying that he is originally in his earlier videos that he is a vampire. He'll go as far as to show his fangs. Literally, they'll pop out and pop back up. Um, and he talks about that he was born like a human, so he would be a dampier, or dompier, however you pronounce that. Um, maybe. Now, the fascinating thing about that is he goes into huge detail about certain things, and we'll get into that in a few seconds here. But the Upir and the Dampier are in a show on Netflix called Hemlock Grove. Uh, I believe that, was it the Upir that is more of a psychic vampire? Yeah.
Yes.
But in the show, both the Upir and the Dampier suck blood. And the Strigoi is in the show The Strain. And the fascinating thing about that is that the infection, if you will, is passed through these parasitic like worms
Mhm.
that will turn somebody into a Strigoi.
Well, there's also actually, to go along with pop culture, there's actually a movie on Netflix called Vampire.
Oh,
I don't know if it's a movie or a TV show. I've come across it a few times and I've considered it, but honestly, it was the first time I heard the word vampire, and I thought it was just like a comedy spoof. And I was like, I don't care to watch that. But now that I see it's actually, a legendary creature, maybe it'll be more exciting.
yeah. So, little pop culture fact and fiction for you guys. If you are ever at an event and they're asking questions for this, you might have the right answer now.
There you go.
Shall we go into what this gentleman in the video talked about a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think we need to. Yeah, let's just talk about some of the theories here. We don't need to worry so much about what he specifically said, but I
Well,
think some of the
yeah,
things that we've looked up
the
is pretty
superstition,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of vampire superstitions throughout history. I mean, how many of us know or believe that in order to stop and I'm not talking about like modern vampires, but just vampires in general. Think of the lore.
Mhm.
Garlic, what does it do? It's supposed to expel vampires for some reason. Sunlight is supposed to harm vampires. Uh, Holy ground is supposed to hurt or keep back vampires. Like they can't walk into a church, supposedly. Vampires have to be invited into a house in order for them to, I don't know, either just enter or to have their midnight snack, if you will. So there's a lot of things that we are kind of pre-educated on via either lore that we've heard growing up or through our lives or through the pop culture. Because obviously, think of From Dusk to Dawn, or really the movie Dracula, or any other vampire movies. A lot of these superstitions are relatable and they're used to help keep these creatures back. In fact, Salem's Lot, one of Stephen King's most famous books, uses sunlight, the cross, and stakes in order to kill the vampires that overrun the town. So this
Mm.
is very, very common. However, some things that we learned, and these are more interesting. So I want everyone to listen with an open mind and maybe give us some of your thoughts on it. But the first one is the idea of garlic. Now, we know, or we believe, most of us, that garlic can keep these ancient vampires, I want to say, at bay, right? These true monsters.
Mm.
However, there has been a argument that maybe we were lied to by vampires and to enable us to eat garlic more often for the benefit of the vampire. And the reason being is that it turns out garlic is a natural blood thinner. And so if you're eating garlic on the regular to keep vampires at bay, and yet the vampire bites you still, that blood won't clot as easily and it'll flow much more smoothly, likely draining the body quicker and smoother than what it would be if someone maybe wasn't on a blood thinner.
It's also a natural antioxidant as well, so it will help with disease, which in most lore you're not going to find that a vampire is worried about that unless for some reason their immortality is kind of fantasized, if you will.
Mm-hmm. No, for sure. Um, Another one is harsh sunlight. Now, sunlight is one of those things, as we know, is supposed to hurt a vampire on impact. As soon as they
Mm.
step into light, we're known that their flesh burns up, they turn to ash, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but what if vampires spread the superstition of sunlight in order to help people feel more safe, more willing to go out of their house and walk around, maybe in more secluded areas because there's sunlight there? Places where maybe a vampire who is actually immune to sunlight can easily pick them off in broad daylight by themselves.
And like I said, who knows? Maybe that particular lore also came from the porphyria situation.
That's true. That is very true.
I mean, it would take a lot, in my opinion, to call somebody a vampire just from porphyria today, because we have much more technology today. But all of this stuff was not done recently. So,
Right. No, for sure. And and I think another part of it, like in regards to the lore, um, the originally, I mean, aside from it being a spirit, so let's move a little further into, or a little closer into modern history. Um, and as it moved, the story of the vampire moved west. We know that it went from a spiritual creature to a more bodily creature, something that
mhm,
takes real form. And so the dead, much like a ghoul, would arise at night primarily. And when we think of some of these entities who are more or less lunar bound,
mhm.
then one can argue, well, we only see this creature at night. This creature only exists in stories at night. Therefore, they must be a night creature and cannot exist in the day. Um, and I think one thing element that we can think that kind of like help sync that together is the idea of nocturnal animals. Now we know that there are nocturnal animals, obviously, um, raccoons, cats, owls. These creatures tend to stay hidden during the daylight most of the time. But when they do come out in daylight, their eyes are the light's just extremely harsh to their eyes. It kind of blinds them a little bit. And so they try to avoid it at all costs because it kind of interrupts their natural ability to see and hunt. And so, likewise, if a vampire is coming out at night only, then it's reasonable to think that it cannot step out into the light without affecting it in some way, some negative way.
Right. Well, and all the more reason for if huge if vampires are real and they've created this uh myth, if you will,
Mhm.
all the more reason for them to do that, just so we're caught off guard during the daylight if we're attacked.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, Sorry, I was looking at something else. So the next thing that we want to talk about is actually the idea of invitation. Now we see invitation a lot in vampire movies, especially in old vampire movies, Dracula in particular, where
Yeah.
a creature of the night has to comes to a window or a door and cannot stop in without first being invited by the person inside the house. Um, Now, that is something that's a little interesting. Like it's kind of intriguing to me to think that if this was a piece of lore that was fake for whatever reason, uh, there's only two things I can think of or one thing I can really think of, and that is the idea that these vampires have some sense of moral code, if you will. You can let your guard down in your house because the vampire cannot enter your home without you first inviting it in. And we all know you're not inviting it in unless you're under the influence of said vampire. Um, and so I think what's interesting about that is that people could potentially let their guard down in their home, relax, let their hair down, maybe expose their neck a little bit, if you will, um, only to have this vampire come in with a predatory attack out of nowhere and drain the person. Um, now, again, this idea of invitation, I think, is much more established in pop culture than it is in historical records. But nonetheless, I think it was supposed to give, especially through Dracula, it was supposed to give this idea of a suave, rich person who has not only a moral code, but has a significance in his existence, in his own existence. He's higher above everyone else. He's the top of the food chain. So it would only make sense that he'd be a gentleman and a scholar and an honor and get along with everybody and be respectful to people. Because in reality, he doesn't want to kill everyone. He just wants a quick snack and then he's out. Of course, that snack can often turn into a new vampire, which is also good for Dracula, I suppose, depending on who it is. But yeah, that's something else to consider is like, how do vampires even change people in the lore? And that goes to something very similar to rabies. It's more so in the enzymes of the saliva that could potentially change a person into this vampiric creature.
Well, it was also just common courtesy back in the day. You didn't walk into somebody's house until they invited you in. There is a little bit of lore about being invited in because there's kind of this veil in a home, spiritual veil, if you will, that you cannot really cross without being harmed unless if you're invited in by the master of the house, whether that's the man or woman of the house, and then you can pass through freely.
Okay.
It's not kind of commonly known anymore, but it was back in the day, yes.
Okay. Well, now with all that said, and there's plenty of other lore out there that we can probably sit here and just go over and debate and argue. Whether or not wooden stakes actually kill a vampire. Let me tell you something. I think a wooden stake's going to kill anything that you put if you're putting it in its heart.
Well, yeah, especially in its heart.
I mean, and if that's the case, anything will do it. I think the wooden stake is one of those things that I always found really interesting because, like, why wood? Like of all things, why wood? It's going to puncture the heart, just like a steel rod would, just like a knife would. In fact, in Dracula, many people might not know this. How does Dracula die? Do you know, Justin?
In the movie or the story?
In the book, how did they kill him ultimately?
I believe what is the woman's name? I believe she's the one that stabs him through the heart.
Okay. Yes, but no. But let's I'm talking more so in regards to what they use to kill him.
I don't remember.
Okay. They actually use basically a Bowie knife. So just a plain old steel Bowie knife that they drive through his heart and he dies. Now, of course, that's Dracula legend, but Dracula is one of those stories that was really manifested everything that we know about vampires today. That was written in the 1800s. And so a lot of the lore that we have stems from Bram Stoker and his story. Now, with that said, again, we've seen many things change. We know Buffy the Vampire Slayer was all about wooden stakes. Many Dracula stories were wooden stakes. Then we get into the Underworld series and we start seeing bullets and silver that kill vampires, silver bullets in particular, much like the legends and the lore of werewolves. So again, we're starting to see some cross references here in which those two creatures once again meet. But yeah, the only thing I could think of in regard to wood, and I think it would have to be sanctified wood, either like a holy wood of some sort, or wood that is carved out of the vampire's own casket or original casket that he was first, before he became a vampire. Somebody dies and then they come back as a vampire.
I think that is in the lore, actually.
Okay.
That originally it had to be from the coffin of the vampire. If I'm not mistaken, I could be off, but I remember hearing that before.
Okay. All right. So now with all that said, I think one of the big things we need to really touch base on here, because it's probably the one thing that's been lurking in the shadows this whole time, even though we've talked about it, is the idea of the vampire drinking blood versus eating food. it's a weird thing to consider. Why blood? And I know we have, this whole superstition, or not even superstition, but the biblical or ancient belief of the blood being the life force, and therefore this
Mhm.
creature, because it's dead and is lifeless, it has to have a life force in order to nourish itself. Why not just eat anything that has blood in it, let alone just drinking blood as is?
And it's undead, not dead.
I'm sorry, undead, undead. Um, well, as we know, there are quite a few creatures within the world that we know of that actually drink blood. Mosquitoes, those itchy little buggers when they bite you. I hate those things. Ticks, I hate those too. I've been bit by three of them. Leeches, I've seen them. Thank God I've not been touched
Yeah,
by
never
them.
been touched by them.
And lampreys are just a few of those animals that actually suck blood. But the one that we can actually focus on that is most similar to the idea of the vampire in Dracula is the vampire bat. We all know the vampire bat. We know this is a creature that literally drinks blood in order to live. But what a lot of people that might not know, I should say, is that the vampire bat actually only survives on blood alone. It doesn't eat anything. It doesn't eat bugs. It doesn't eat fruit like other bats. It drinks blood only. And I think the main distinction of being one of the only mammals who survive entirely on blood and how they've managed to do that has been a big source of interest to the scientific community. Now, here's some details on the back because I think this is really interesting, and it could help us to understand the lore of the vampire or even the scientific aspect. If you remember way back at the beginning of the episode, I had said that even though the Western culture, the Americas especially, were starting to drift away from superstition, there was one that held on, and that was the vampire, because science was intrigued by it and they wanted to understand the existence and the possibility of these creatures. And the vampire bat really helps us do that because there are morphological adaptations like sharp teeth and enzymes in the saliva specialized for numbing prey that are critical to the success of the creature gaining blood for food. Now, important is that the adaptations going on inside the vampire's bat or inside the vampire bats is really what makes the creature unique. Uh, there was research published in the Journal of Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, which suggests that vampire bats adapted a specialized microbiome, which includes hundreds of important bacterial colonies, enabling them to survive on blood alone. But the thing is, blood isn't very nutritious. It doesn't have very many vitamins. It's pretty low in protein and it's very difficult for the kidneys to process. And so the bacteria in the vampire's bats microbiome helps bridge the gap by synthesizing vitamins the bats don't receive from their diet and breaking down proteins. So, with that in mind, we can kind of argue that if vampires do exist, well, there's a scientific explanation as to why they might drink blood and can only sustain themselves on blood. And it's through those microbial colonies, which would have to be very much existent within their bodies in order to do so.
The interesting thing about that, after I read it, another pop culture fact is in the Dresden Files, um, the vampires of the Red Court have an enzyme in their saliva that kind of drugs people,
Mhm.
makes them more susceptible to just letting the vampire drink their blood. And if they're drinking, the saliva's obviously going in the bloodstream as well. You're not going to necessarily be turned just by bitting them. They may not, in the Dresden Files, anyways. And you may not die or you may not be turned. But that's what fascinated me about this article was because I'm huge into pop culture. You
Mhm.
you all probably know that already. But to see that the vampire bat has the numbing agent in it could be kind of where the author of the Dresden Files kind of got that particular lore from. to add into his story.
For sure, for sure. Um, I think I got some more unique facts here that are very interesting. I think that help us to, if a vampire actually exists, the ancient vampires that drank blood, um, they have to be able to sustain energy, and they need to be able to sustain that energy through blood alone. So we need to start thinking about, I mean, aside from the microbiome helping them, various vitamins that they would need, the amount of calories they would need in order to process their metabolism, things like that. And so, just for reference, blood has about 700 calories per liter, and there's roughly 5 liters in the average adult human body. Now, that means there's plenty of calories for a single person within a body, about 30, or within blood, I should say, of a body, roughly about 3,500, which can keep them going pretty much for the entire day. But that also requires drinking 5 liters or 1.5 gallons of blood in a single go. Now, the human stomach can stand to about 4 liters when it needs to, but it would be very uncomfortable. Think about that Thanksgiving dinner you had, right? You eat one too many plates and you're feeling pretty full. So drinking 1.5 gallons of blood, you're probably going to not be feeling very well. And one thing we need to consider is that this vampire, based on lore, isn't actually a separate creature from humanity. It is technically still human, has human functions, human body, a human mind. It's just the vampiric aspect of it that has changed, going from a normal human to this creature of the night. Now, the average vampire would perpetually walk around with this blood in their belly, just uncomfortably. And that wouldn't make much sense. They wouldn't be doing very much. They'd go out, have a drink, and then just sleep the rest of the night. But vampires could easily survive on a couple meals a day. So, like 1.5 to 2 liters of blood at a time. This would be more comfortable, and they can more or less get 3 meals a day, maybe a couple snacks in between, and sustain their energy throughout the night and while they're sleeping. However, the idea that their metabolism would be like ours is probably improbable. In fact, it's likely that a vampire's metabolism would be much higher, based on its overall changes to its body, I guess. Consider the vampire bat's weight is an average of 34 grams, okay? And they're required 20 grams of blood per day to survive. Now, vampire bats' metabolism is so fast that they'll actually die if they miss more than a couple of meals in a single day. Now, 20 grams represents about 60% of vampire bats' total body weight. So if a vampire had to drink an equivalent amount of blood to survive, they would need roughly 95 pounds of blood every single day. And being that blood makes up about 10% of a person's total body weight, and therefore, considering every one vampire would need 6 people to drain every single night, that vampire who has a lifespan of, say, 500 years would consume roughly the blood of over 1 million people. And if we're saying there's more than one vampire in existence, that's roughly the end of humanity. Not to mention the idea that vitamin D could be difficult to get, vitamin C could be difficult to get. In fact, blood would only give you about 25 milligrams of vitamin C if you were to drain an entire body. But the human body needs roughly 45 milligrams per day. So it's hard to say that these creatures would actually be able to consistently live and hunt on a daily basis without making the world aware, and without simply drinking every couple minutes.
Well, and to add to that, I mean, there's plenty of humans that don't get their daily vitamin C, D, B12, all of that.
Right. So it's probably their blood probably has even less than what the normal human body has,
Right.
Or at least what the human body should have.
And you brought up the metabolism thing. If they have the abilities that are in the lore, superhuman speed, superhuman strength, maybe not transforming into animals, because that would be, in my opinion, outside of vampire if they're humans.
Right. We're
Anyways,
moving in that case, you're moving from a corporeal, human-like entity that drinks blood to a supernatural entity that
right.
lives outside of the bonds of humanity.
It makes a lot of sense what you were talking about is if they are like humans and their metabolism is very much like humans. If they're moving super fast, if they can lift, I mean, you can attest to this being a weightlifter.
Yeah.
You need a lot of protein, you need a lot of vitamins to keep your body the way that it is.
Right.
So that was that entire article fascinated me as well because just learning the enzymes thing, the microbes that help a vampire bat process the blood so that it gets everything it needs. Um, and then going into, well, if vampires do exist, this is what they would need in order to survive if they're only surviving off of blood.
Right.
Um, so in your mind, reading through this stuff, would it be possible in your mind that vampires truly do exist outside of the supernatural stuff?
Outside of the supernatural. Um, in regards to the myths, the lore, I would say no. It's just not probable based on the science of it. Now, that's not to say somehow it evades scientific reason altogether. Um, but if we're going based on the idea that this is a human or a being that was once human who became a vampire, who has no special abilities to change or do anything that is supernatural, but still has to only survive on blood alone, chances are, based on the metabolism and the science backing it, they just simply would not be able to. They would probably die within the first couple of nights of being a vampire because they wouldn't be able to find enough food. If you consider that, the amount of 6 people a night, right? 6 people a night, even if they were to kill animals instead of people, eventually livestock would die out in whatever region that they're at, and they'd have to move on. And we'd be
Mm.
seeing that over and over and over again throughout the world as these vampires move. And then to consider there's probably more than one vampire, well, that number becomes a lot bigger and it increases a lot faster. So in regards to those vampires, I say no. I don't think they exist.
We'll take this into account.
Okay.
What if this vampirism is a type of infection and gives them the same, I shouldn't say same, similar microbes that a vampire bat would have?
Well, even if they have the same microbes, they would still have to drink an enormous amount of blood every night.
I
And you're
gotcha.
still thinking, if the science is correct, you're still thinking about 6 people per night in order
Yeah.
to survive and keep your energy up.
Yeah. I mean, I want to believe vampires are real just because I love the vampire and werewolf lore. You
Oh,
know
for sure. 100%.
that.
I'm there with you. Um, but at the same time, it's just like, and even though there's individuals who come out and claim they're vampires, they try to show us things like the person on TikTok that you were talking about, or Instagram or Facebook or wherever they're at. The simple fact is, there's still no proof. There's no proof in the pudding. It's just one person's word that, they're sharing on a platform which has AI generated in it. And so someone showing their things, that could be easily done through just a little bit of CGI. You probably don't even have to do much these days anymore. Um, but on top of that, if the entities were real, if vampires are real, we'd have a lot more information on it. Now, that's something that we did learn, which was interesting in New Orleans, is that the Catholic Church actually had imprisoned vampires at one of the churches down there. And even to this day, those vampires are still existing within the church, but the church itself is closed down. No one can go in. But they claim on, was it third floor or something? They have
Yeah.
multiple vampires chained up. Where they're, I don't know what if they're just in prison or they're testing them or what, but this is something that the Catholic Church at one point was kind of adamant on, that these creatures did exist. Now that's to say something. I don't know. I don't believe everything the Vatican says.
Well, right. I was
They
gonna say
are,
there's a lot of things that
you know,
the
I mean, I
Catholic
don't, I
Church
don't believe
says.
our government and the Vatican Church is stronger than our governments. So
Right. Yeah. Well, and Eric tried to get turn
I
unsuccessfully while
did.
we
I
were in
did try,
Orleans
and
too.
it didn't happen, which means likely they don't exist because I did everything I could.
More so, we didn't get into places where that would have been
We don't. We can
possible.
leave things out. We don't need to tell people everything.
Leaving out facts. I don't think that's what ParaTruth's all about.
No, but that's what lawyers do, and in this case, I'm defending myself.
All right. Anything to add before we end for the day?
I would say that definitely, as you're listening to this episode or if you're listening to it again at some point in the future, really take a moment to do some of the research yourself and see what it is we found. And we'll post our links with this episode as well, so you guys can click on those, check out those articles. But there's plenty of articles out there. On top of that, despite the things that we shared, both in terms of lore and science, I think it's important for all of us to keep our minds open and aware, because there's a possibility that all of this science was developed by vampires to make us believe they don't exist.
Very valid point. Same thing can be said about demons and the
Anything.
devil as well.
Yep, all of it.
Well, with that being said, we've got a Halloween finale, as we always do every time October rolls around. So stay tuned for that, folks. We've got a lot of great stuff planned. And that's pretty much it. Until next time, my name is Justin.
And I'm Eric. Peace.